They say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but I think we all understand that that's not really true. Certainly we can feel stupid when we ask a question, because one aspect of a question is that we are revealing a little bit about ourselves, or we can be, by asking it. And in that case, we might be revealing our ignorance in a particular area, and it might be embarrassing for us to do so. And so one interesting feature of a question is it can reveal more about the person asking the question than it does about the person being questioned. And we appreciate that from a very young age. Even when our children were little, if we'd be sitting around the table and I would ask one of them, "Are you going to finish that?" They knew instinctively that I wasn't interested primarily in learning about their well-being and making sure that they were fed. They would sort of defend their plate a little bit because they knew that I was revealing by that question that I had some designs for whatever was still there and whatever they hadn't eaten. So questions reveal a little bit, or they can reveal something about the questioner. And that's true sometimes done on by accident, but it can also be done on purpose. I can imagine a scenario with my children where I come across them and I see them playing and I ask them, "What do you think you're doing?" They know that I am not trying to gain information. "Well, you see, Dad, we're playing bobsled, and I'm going to push my little brother down the stairs in this cardboard box." That's not the response I'm anticipating. They know I'm trying to make a point and convey to them something. I want them to pay attention and think about the consequences of what they're doing, and depending on my tone, I'm also revealing my confusion, my amusement, or my anger with whatever it is they're doing. So questions can reveal things about the person asking the question. And I mention all of this because I've been reading recently through the Old Testament, and when I got to 1 Kings chapter 22, I read a story about Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And in that passage, he asks a question. And then a couple chapters later, in 2 Kings chapter 3, he finds himself in a similar situation and asks the same question. And so it made me pause and wonder what was going on, and the repetition drew my attention to it and sort of prompted a study into Jehoshaphat's life, and that's what I want to share with you today. We're going to look at 3 events from his life, and we're going to consider them through the lens of questions that are asked in those passages. And I trust that as we do, it will reveal something about Jehoshaphat and about his character and about his priorities. Now, Jehoshaphat was a king. None of us share those responsibilities or those roles. He lived many hundreds of years ago in a different culture in a different part of the world. And yet, despite all those differences, I think the questions that were asked are relevant for us today. And so I trust that as we study them together, that there'll be lessons that are applicable to us as well. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at 3 events from the life of Jehoshaphat. So, if you have a Bible, we're going to start in 2 Chronicles chapter 18. We'll give you a chance to turn there. One of the challenges of recording these things in advance is you can't see anybody and you can't hear the rustling of pages. So, I'll give you some time to turn, and I'll leave you on the honor system to make sure that you're following along. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind you a little bit about the history of Israel up to this point. So you'll recall we'll start in Egypt, where they were slaves for many hundreds of years, and then the Lord brought them out under Moses. They wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then were brought into the promised land under Joshua. After Joshua passed away, they were ruled not by kings, but by a series of judges, until the people demanded a king, and then got Saul, and then later David and Solomon. And under those 3 rulers, there was one united nation. But after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam became king, and under his reign, the country was split into 2, the northern kingdom of Israel, which was about 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which was the remaining 2. And so Jehoshaphat is the son of Asa, who is the son of Abijah, who is the son of Rehoboam, who's obviously the son of Solomon. So that makes him Solomon's great-grandson. He's king of Judah, and his story actually begins in 2 Chronicles chapter 17. You can read that on your own. And it describes that overall he was a good king. Right? The kings of Israel in the north were pretty much without exception awful, Judah had a little bit more spotty record. Some of the kings were good and some of the kings were bad. Jehoshaphat falls into the former category. He was a good guy and he was intent on following the Lord. And so we're going to pick up his story here in 2 Chronicles 18. Again, I made reference to kings in the beginning. We're going to limit ourselves in this book because the account of Jehoshaphat's life is a little bit more condensed and consecutive. But if you want, you can go back and read some of the parallel passages in 1st and 2nd Kings as well. So we're going to pick up this first event in 1 Kings chapter 18, and we'll start reading in verse 1. Now Jehoshaphat had great wealth and honor, and he allied himself with Ahab by marriage. Some years later he went down to visit Ahab in Samaria. Ahab slaughtered many sheep and cattle for him and the people with him, and urged him to attack Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab, king of Israel, asked Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, "Will you go with me against Ramoth-Gilead?" Jehoshaphat replied, "I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will join you in the war." But Jehoshaphat also said to the king of Israel, "First seek the counsel of the Lord." So the king of Israel brought together the prophets, 400 men, and asked them, "Shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall I refrain?" "Go," they answered, "for God will give it into the king's hand." But Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there not a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of?" The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, "There is still one man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." And so we see at the beginning of this passage that Jehoshaphat has allied himself with the king of Israel, who was Ahab at the time. Ahab, you may recognize that name, was a wicked king, worshiper of Baal. He was married to Jezebel. And so Jehoshaphat has allied himself with Ahab, and he's done that by marrying his son, Jehoram, to Ahab's daughter, Ahaziah. Now, we don't know, Athaliah. There's a lot of names to keep track, and you'll probably get mix them up as I will, but I'll try and keep them all straight. Athaliah. We don't know if Athaliah was also Jezebel's daughter, but based on her subsequent behavior, it wouldn't be a surprise. So these two are married, and it creates a sort of political union between the country, and we're not sure exactly what Jehoshaphat's motives were for doing this. They could have been sort of patriotic to sort of build linkages between the various descendants of Abraham, but for whatever reason, these children are married together. It creates this political alliance. And when he goes to visit Ahab, convinces Jehoshaphat to join him in a military alliance. They have this feast, and he says, "I want to go and I want to retake Ramoth-Gilead." This was a city in the northern part of Israel. It was a Levitical city. It was a city of refuge, but it had been taken over by the Arameans, or you might think of it as Assyria, this nation that was north of Israel. And so Ahab proposes this battle and says, "I want to go retake Ramoth-Gilead. Will you come with me?" And Jehoshaphat says, "Yes, my people will be as your people. Let's go. But first, let's inquire of the Lord." And Ahab trots out these prophets, and there's 400 of them, and they do their song and dance, and unanimously agree that they should go and fight this battle and that they will be victorious. But Jehoshaphat is unconvinced, and so he says, "Is there not a prophet of the Lord that we can inquire of?" And this is the question that got my attention originally. We read it in the parallel passage of this event in 1 Kings chapter 22, and we won't read it, but your homework is to go and read 2 Kings chapter 3. Jehoshaphat finds himself in a similar situation, going into battle with one of Ahab's sons, who was king of Israel at the time, and he asks a similar question. And so the question for us, in light of that question, is what does it reveal to us about Jehoshaphat? And there's a couple things. I think it reveals his heart, that he has a desire to seek the Lord and his guidance. And it also reveals some discernment on his part. He knew that he was not getting divine advice from these false prophets. And so he asks for a real prophet to be brought. Ahab is a little reluctant because has been burned by previous prophecies from this guy, but he's sent for, and we'll pick up the story in verse 12. The messenger goes to get Micaiah. It says, the messenger who had gone to summon Micaiah said to him, look, as one man, the other prophets are predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs and speak favorably. But Micaiah said, as surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what my God says. When he arrived, the king asked him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall I refrain? Attack and be victorious, he answered, for they will be given into your hand. The king said to him, how many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? Then Micaiah answered, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and the Lord said, these people have no master. Let each one go home in peace. So Micaiah is brought, and his prophecy is that Ahab is going to die in this battle. And what's concerning is that despite this, Jehoshaphat agrees to continue on nevertheless. So they make their plans and they go on. And so while he seemed to have some desire to know the will of the Lord and some discernment to know when he was not receiving divine instruction, once he received it, he chose not to follow it. And we're not told exactly why. We can assume perhaps that it had something to do with maintaining this alliance with Israel, but we don't know for sure. And so they make plans to go into battle, and we'll continue on with the story still in chapter 18 in verse 28. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth-Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. Now the king of Aram had ordered his chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel. So they turned to attack him, but Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him. God drew them away from him, for when the chariot commanders saw that he was not the king of Israel, they stopped pursuing him. But someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. The king told the chariot driver, wheel around and get me out of the fighting, I've been wounded. All day long the battle raged, and the king of Israel propped himself up in his chariot, facing the Arameans, until evening. Then at sunset he died. So despite this message from prophet Micaiah, both Ahab and Jehoshaphat agree to go into battle. Ahab seems to think that he can avoid the fate that he's been warned of by disguising himself. They can't kill the king of Israel. He's probably thinking if they don't know who the king of Israel is. So when they go into battle, Jehoshaphat is the only one that is apparelled like a king. And so the enemy single in on him, or focus in on him, single him out, and want to destroy him. And he's about to be killed, and he calls out to God, and God makes them realize that this is not who they were looking for, and they turn away from him. And despite his best attempts, Ahab is still killed in the battle. And so what we learn from this experience is that Jehoshaphat wanted to seek the will of the Lord, and he knew who he could trust and who he could not trust to deliver it to him. But we see that he had some problems obeying. When he received that instruction, he continued on, and he almost lost his life as a result. We'll continue on with our second event, which will be in chapter 20. You'll notice we're skipping over chapter 19. We are coming back here, but let's move right now to chapter 20. At the start of the chapter, Jehoshaphat is warned that 3 of the neighboring countries have banded together and created a super army that is assembling on the other side of the Dead Sea and is on their way to come and wipe them out. And so he's disturbed by this, and he gathers together the people, and they pray to the Lord. If you're in chapter 20, we'll start in verse 3. Alarmed, Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all Judah. The people of Judah came together to seek the help from the Lord. Indeed, they came from every town in Judah to seek him. Then Jehoshaphat stood up in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem at the temple of the Lord in front of the new courtyard and said, O Lord, God of our fathers, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. O our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? They have lived in it and have built in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we shall stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name, and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. But now here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt, so they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of our possession you gave us as an inheritance. O our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. So there's these three countries that are banded together: Mount Seir, or Edom, or the descendants of Esau, and then Moab and Ammon, who are the descendants of Lot. And they've created this great army. And Jehoshaphat knows that they're in trouble. They can't meet that incoming army. They're just too outmatched. And so he gathers together the people and he prays to the Lord. And I've been in a number of prayer meetings in my lifetime, and I'm sure you have as well. I can't think of a prayer similar to this that I've heard in any of those meetings. There's a boldness to Jehoshaphat's prayer that is worth paying attention to. He begins by sort of asking some questions. Are you not the God of heaven? Don't you rule over all the nations? Isn't this the land that you promised to Abraham your friend? And you just brought our people into it, and you destroyed the people that were here. And he accounts through all this history that they have. And there's a number of questions that he asks in that time, but the one that I want to draw your attention to is the one in verse 12. O our God, will you not judge them? He realizes that the people are outmatched, and he points out to the Lord that those three nations that are coming against them are three nations that they were told not to attack when they were brought out of Egypt. And so he's coming to the Lord very boldly, and he's saying, this is on you. What are you going to do? O Lord, will you not judge? It's a very bold claim. And he ends by saying, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. He's basically putting all of it in God's court. And now let's see God's response. Spirit comes upon a fellow who is there, and he says in verse 15, listen, King Jehoshaphat, and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem, this is what the Lord says to you. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow march down against them. They will be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge in the desert of Jeruel. You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions, stand firm, and see the deliverance the Lord will give you. O Judah and Jerusalem, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. So, Jehoshaphat asks this question, O Lord, will you not judge? It's a bold claim, and it reveals his faith and his confidence in the Lord's ability and power to deal with the situation, even though everything seemed hopeless. And that faith is rewarded in kind, because God says, you want to put this all on me? Fine. I will take care of things. This battle isn't yours. This battle will be mine. You go, stand, and watch, and see what I'm going to do. And so they take him at his word, and they get ready, and they prepare the next morning, and they head out to the battle, and they put singers at the front. And if we were to read the passage, we would find that as they go out and as the singers begin to sing, God acts. And he takes two of those nations, the descendant of Lot, Ammon and Moab, and they conspire against the third group, Edom, or Mount Seir, and they turn on them and wipe the Edomites out. And then those two remaining countries turn on each other and wipe each other out, such that when the army of Judah arrives at the battle, their enemy has been destroyed. They've defeated themselves. There's nothing for them left to do because there's no enemy left. God has done everything. He's rewarded Jehoshaphat and the people for their faith by not even requiring them to draw their sword. And all that's left for them is really to give thanks to God and then to go and loot the things that have been left behind. And so this question, O our God, will you not judge, reveals Jehoshaphat's faith and confidence in God's ability and willingness to come and deal with the existential threat, really, that they're facing at that time. For our final passage, we're going to turn to back to chapter 19. So we've looked at two questions so far. Is there not a prophet of the Lord here that we can inquire of? And, O our God, will you not judge? Those are questions that were asked by Jehoshaphat, and they revealed a little bit about him and his character and his thinking. Third question we want to consider is asked of Jehoshaphat. A prophet comes to him with a message from the Lord and puts this question to him, and we'll consider it now. This is chapter 19, immediately after the battle where Ahab is killed. Verse 1, chapter 19. When Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, returned safely to his palace in Jerusalem, Jehu the seer, the son of Hanani, went out to meet him and said to the king, "Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, the wrath of the Lord is upon you. There is, however, some good in you, for you have rid the land of the Asherah poles and have set your heart on seeking God." Jehoshaphat was a good king. He did a lot of good things, and we've seen some great characteristics of him so far. But he seemed obsessed with creating alliances with Israel, with Ahab, with his son. There's multiple passages of battles and expeditions where they build boats and so on that to go and gather gold. He's always trying to build these alliances with Israel. And the question that's put to him by the prophet is, should you help the wicked and love those, or the footnote in my Bible says, make alliances with those who hate the Lord? He confronts Jehoshaphat about these dealings. And it reveals something about Jehoshaphat, but also something about how the Lord feels about what he's done. And we can see that the negative consequences that these alliances bring. Very immediately we see that Jehoshaphat almost lost his life in this battle with Ahab. And that would be bad. But the consequences of his alliances, particularly the marriage between his son and Ahab's daughter, sort of ripples out, and no matter what his intentions were in trying to do this and how good they might have been, that marriage has disastrous results for the nation. I want to consider that with you. Because when Jehoshaphat passes away, Jehoram, who is the son who's married to Athaliah, daughter of Ahab, Jehoram becomes king. And his very first act is to kill his brothers and others that had claim to the throne in order to secure his reign. Instead of following after the Lord and following the example of his father and his grandfather, instead he follows after the example of the king of Israel and leads the people into idolatry and so on. So this person who comes along after Jehoram, who's married to Athaliah, the basis for this political alliance, is a disastrous king. And now it's hard to know how much of this to put on Jehoram himself and how much is the negative influence of Athaliah. We don't know. She certainly reveals her character later and in a very dramatic and bloody way. But we do know that Jehoram was a horrible, horrible leader. Flip over to end of chapter 22, or excuse me, the end of chapter 21. Chapter 21 describes sort of the political and spiritual darkness that descends on the country during Jehoram's reign. And we'll just read the summary in verse 18. After this, the Lord afflicted Jehoram with an incurable disease of the bowels. In the course of time, at the end of the second year, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great pain. His people made no fire in his honor as they had for his fathers. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He passed away to no one's regret and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. This is the summary of those 8 horrible years when Jehoram was king. And that would be bad as well if it stopped there, but it doesn't. Things get worse. After Jehoram passes away, their son Ahaziah becomes king, son of Athaliah and Jehoram. Ahaziah becomes king. He only reigns for about a year because he goes up to visit Israel and stumbles into the middle of a coup. And so the king of Israel is killed, and Ahaziah and his retinue is hunted down, and they're killed as well. And so there's no king for Judah. And so Athaliah sees her opportunity and seizes the opportunity to kill the rest of the heirs and take the throne for herself. And her children and even her grandchildren are killed, and the other children of Jehoram. Her own grandson, Joash, is hidden away by his aunt and eventually will be crowned king. But Athaliah will rule as this sort of foreign queen for many, many years and be a miserable time for the nation of Israel. So again, think back to that question. Should we help the wicked? Should you love or make alliances with those who hate the Lord? And we think of the consequences of those decisions that Jehoshaphat made, no doubt with the best of intentions. Resulted in his near death in the battle. It resulted in the death of many of his children and grandchildren, multiple generations of bloodshed, and it brought the country into a time of political darkness and, more importantly, spiritual darkness that took a long time to recover from. I'm recording this on Saturday. It's going to be played on Father's Day. This is obviously not a Father's Day message, but it's a good opportunity, I think, to consider our actions as fathers and as parents and how they might affect our families and our communities in different ways. Again, often we'll convince ourselves that the end justifies the means, but we see here that no matter what Jehoshaphat's intentions are, the consequences of his decisions were horrible for his family and for his nation. And so it's an opportunity for us to reflect as well about how our own relationships, whether it be personal relationships or work relationships or even relationships within our spiritual communities, can have disastrous effects that we don't anticipate. And so a good warning for us to consider those decisions really, really carefully. So just as we close, we'll recap some of the events that we looked at and the questions that were asked or asked by Jehoshaphat and what we can learn from them. The first was, is there not a prophet of the Lord here that we can inquire of? This speaks to us of his desire to follow the Lord, his desire to know what God wants, and his discernment to distinguish false prophecy from true prophecy. Unfortunately, he didn't follow through, and so there's a reminder to us of the need not just to seek God's will and his counsel, but actually to obey it. The second question that we considered was, O our God, will you not judge them? Faced with this incredible army that was assembled against them, and knowing they had no way to defend themselves, Jehoshaphat goes and he prays boldly to God and says, this is on you. What are you going to do? You wouldn't let us attack them before, and now they're turning on us. Aren't you going to judge them? And we see that the faith that question demonstrates and the confidence in God's ability to deliver them from this overwhelming enemy is rewarded, because God gives them this dramatic victory where they don't even have to do anything. They just show up and loot because their enemies has destroyed themselves. They just get to see God's hand at work. And then finally, the third question was posed to Jehoshaphat by the prophet: should you help the wicked and love those or make alliances with those who hate the Lord? And so we saw repeatedly in Jehoshaphat's life that he wanted to make alliances with the kings of Israel in various different forms. And we saw the disastrous consequences that had for himself, in that he almost died, but also for his family and for his nation. And so it's a warning to us to think about the relationships that we build. And so, again, we said this at the outset, but none of us are kings, right? None of us face are in the same circumstances as Jehoshaphat, have those responsibilities. And he lived many hundreds of years ago in a very different time. But those questions that were asked by him or of him, I think, are relevant to us today, and we do well to consider them together. Are we seeking the Lord's guidance? And when we get it, can we discern? And when we know it to be true, do we obey it? Do we have faith like Jehoshaphat? Can we come to God boldly and ask him for things and turn things over to him and trust that he will act, and not expect that and understand that there's nothing that we can do in those situations? Excuse me. And then finally, the question that was put to him by the prophet: should do you love the wicked or help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? I don't think the message is that we're to hate other people, right? Or to not seek to help them. I think the message for us is that by allying ourselves, building alliances with people with different priorities, we can be helping them further their goals, which may be completely counter to the objectives and the desires that God has for us and for our community. So we want to be careful about the relationships that we build, whether they're our personal relationships or our work relationships or spiritual communities, those relationships as well. Because as we saw with Jehoshaphat, even if they're done for the best of intentions, they can have consequences in the short term and the long term that we can't anticipate, so we need to be careful. So I hope there's been something of value for you today as we've considered Jehoshaphat, some of the things he did really well, and some of the mistakes he made. And those questions, I think, are valuable to us, because as much as they reveal something about Jehoshaphat, we can turn them around on ourselves and consider them and find them equally revealing.